Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, even if it is only virtually. December 9th, 1621, a Sunday. The Plymouth colonists walked to the fort at the top of the hill, a fort which also serves as their meeting house. We might imagine snow on the ground. We can only estimate how many gathered. Of the approximately 100 settlers who had arrived on the Mayflower the previous December, close to half had died in the spring. Some of those who are approaching the meeting house are surviving members of the original congregation that had been formed in Scrooby, England, early in the century. Others had joined that church during its decade-long stay in Leiden, the Netherlands. In November of 1621, a ship, the Fortune, had arrived from England with supplies and 35 new colonists, few of whom can be identified as Puritans. On this December Sabbath, William Brewster, the congregation's elder and leader, leads the way to the fort, accompanied by Governor William Bradford. Samuel Fuller, the deacon who also served as the settlement's physician, is there as well. While relations with the local tribe, the Wampanoags, were strong, recently highlighted by what has become known as the First Thanksgiving, other natives in the area had been threatening, and so all the men carry a musket or firelock, watched by their military captain, Miles Standish. The congregation's pastor, John Robinson, had remained in Leiden with the majority of the congregants. In his absence, Elder William Brewster typically supervised both morning and afternoon Sabbath services. In the morning, Brewster would typically open with a short extemporaneous prayer, followed by a series of scripture readings and a discussion of the text. The sermon would be preceded and followed by the singing of psalms. The afternoon service would be similar, though also allowing members of the congregation to raise questions and discuss matters of faith. This lay involvement, referred to as prophesying, was an element of congregational practice which was strongly supported by both John Robinson and Brewster. In the absence of an ordained clergyman, sermons in Plymouth were preached by Brewster and other lay members of the congregation. On the occasion of the services on December 9th, 1621, the preacher was Robert Cushman. His message epitomized the Puritan outlook on society and was an expression of what I have called the Puritan social gospel, which is my focus today. But before looking at the sermon itself, let's set some context. Who was Robert Cushman? He was a Puritan who had joined the Leiden congregation from Canterbury, England, where he had likely been attending a conference of like-minded believers as early as 1591. He was prosecuted there, first for posting criticisms of the National Church of England in 1603, and then again 3 years later for espousing views contrary to official church teachings. He had emigrated and eventually settled at Leiden, where the Robinson congregation admitted him and later elected him to be a deacon. After the congregation decided to relocate to America, Cushman played a key role in negotiating English approval for the colonizing effort. He also negotiated an agreement with various merchants in England to fund the venture. Some of the prospective colonists were sharply critical of him when he felt forced to acquiesce in last-minute changes to the agreement with the merchants, that were demanded by the merchant backers. Despite this, Cushman was prepared in 1620 to emigrate along with his family. But the Speedwell, the ship hired to accompany the Mayflower, had to be abandoned for being unseaworthy, requiring a redistribution of people and goods. Cushman was one of those who stayed behind in England in 1620. But he then arrived in Plymouth on the Fortune, along with Elder Brewster's son, Jonathan, Edward Winslow's brother, John, and 35 newcomers described by the colony's Governor William Bradford as most of them lusty, strong young men, and many of them wild enough, who had been sent by the Venture's English backers. Though some of the passengers on the Mayflower had not been members of the Leyden congregation, those who were not were, for the most part, English Puritans. But this was not true of the 35 young men mentioned by Bradford. Under the terms of the colonist agreement with the English undertakers, for the first 7 years of the colony, the colonists did not own their own land or the products of their labor, which were to go into a common store. This was not, as sometimes depicted, a policy of communism willingly adopted by the settlers, but a price they had to pay in order to gain the financial support they needed. Most of the men of the fortune were neither Puritans nor members of the Leyden congregation. They were placed in the households of existing Plymouth families, and it is likely that they had not signed up for the roles they were expected to play. The colony's leaders worried about whether or not they would accept the community ethos. Most of these men were, I might point out, the individuals who later in the month, on December 25th, would refuse to enter the fields to work on the pretense of observing the birth of the Lord, and then, as it turned out, observe the day by playing openly in the street, as Bradford put it, some pitching the bar and some at stool ball and other such sports. Their presence created tensions in the community, tensions that called to mind the rising individualism that the original colonists had left Europe hoping to escape. The members of the Leyden Church had been troubled by what Cushman would call in his sermon, the bird of self-love, which had been hatched in Europe. He was referring to the rising tide of an individualist ethos, which encouraged each person to seek his or her own interest, often at the expense of the community. It was an ethos known to have been evident in other colonial ventures, where unruly individuals disrupted society as they pursued their selfish interest. One of the original Mayflower colonists, Stephen Hopkins, could well have shared his insights into how this had brought tragedy to the Virginia colony. A member of a 1609 expedition to relieve and reinforce the Jamestown settlement, the ship Hopkins traveled on, the Sea Venture, had shipwrecked on the coast of Bermuda during a hurricane. 9 months later, after building a boat capable of bringing them to Virginia, the voyagers finally reached their destination. They found that hundreds of the colonists who had lived in the Jamestown settlement had died. The survivors had been driven to eat their domestic animals, as well as rats and snakes that they could catch. They chewed on the leather of their shoes for sustenance. The acting governor of the colony, George Percy, later recalled that nothing was spared to maintain life. Some went so far as, quote, to dig up dead corpses in graves and to eat them. And some have licked up the blood which had fallen from their weak fellows. But amongst the rest, Percy continued, this was the most lamentable. One of our colony murdered his wife, ripped a child out of her womb, and threw it into the river. After this, he chopped the mother into pieces and salted her for his food, which wasn't discovered until he had eaten parts of her. We sometimes refer to highly competitive, individualistic impulses as dog eat dog. This went much further and was a memory likely scored into the consciousness of the Mayflower passenger, Stephen Hopkins. Some believed that Hopkins' warnings of such dangers had contributed to the decision to draft and adopt the Mayflower Compact before the original colonists disembarked, a document modeled after congregational religious covenants that bound the colonists together socially and politically. The hardships faced by the original Plymouth colonists in their first year may have tempted some of them to question that agreement and focus on that personal welfare rather than the common good. Certainly, there were grumblings that the amount each family drew from the common store was not proportionate to the work they put in. Cushman was aware of this as he spoke, but it is likely that his concerns were equally shaped by his impression of the young men he had journeyed to America with on the Fortune. He warned, "That bird of self-love which was hatched at home, if it be not looked to, will eat out the life of all grace and goodness." And he continued, "Though men have escaped the danger of the sea and that cruel mortality which swept away so many of our living friends and brethren, yet except they purge out this self-love, a worse mischief is prepared for them." Cushman's guiding text for his sermon was 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 24. "Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth." He urged his listeners that they seek the good of your brethren, please them, honor them, reverence them. And as we shall see, this was not an original message, and a comparison with a comparable lay sermon will help us to understand the broader context of Cushman's message. This Plymouth layman's message was very similar to that which the layman John Winthrop would deliver to another, much larger group of Puritans as they prepared to sail from Southampton to New England in the spring of 1630. And it is certainly possible, even likely, that as Winthrop considered the task he was about to undertake, he would have read Cushman's address to an earlier group of Puritan colonists. There is only one manuscript copy of Winthrop's sermon, generally referred to as a model of Christian charity. It is a copy by a contemporary, and it appears that the opening might be missing. A recent scholar has suggested that the sermon originally opened with Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 to 14. "For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not your liberty as an occasion unto the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, which is this: thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." The most famous and misunderstood passage of Winthrop's sermon is the one in which he told those joining him in the planting of Massachusetts Bay Colony that if they did their utmost to understand and live by God's wishes, they would be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. I say misrepresented because many historians and other writers have claimed that this is the beginning of the idea of American exceptionalism, that Winthrop was asserting for the colony and the country that emerged from it a special place in history. But the Massachusetts governor was issuing a familiar call based on Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 to 16, that the members of the community he was addressing live exemplary lives, becoming a model of goodness, of godliness that would inspire others to do the same. By exploring this further, we can shed new light on Cushman's message. At this time, communities and individuals known for their godliness were often addressed as cities on a hill, lights to the world, and candles on candlesticks. Cushman did not employ the specific image of a city on a hill in his 1621 sermon, but the idea is implicit. And he did use it in a separate discussion of congregationalism, writing in that book, Mount Zion is everywhere, and every Christian is both the temple of the Lord in a sense, as also a little mountain of holiness, from whom the law of God and his will must flow out of all just occasions to neighbors, brethren, countrymen, strangers, etc. And Cushman did predict in his Plymouth sermon that so also shall you be an encouragement to many of your Christian friends in your native country to come to you when they hear of your peace, love, and kindness that is amongst you. Years later, Plymouth's Governor Bradford would use the image when he wrote of the colony that as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light kindled hath shone unto many. Plymouth was the small candle that lit the other candles of New England, and Bradford hoped that the light from all of them might inspire the transformation of England. So Cushman, like Winthrop, wanted the men and women he addressed to live exemplary lives. And central to that task was to love their neighbors as themselves. This entailed the rejecting of temptations to self-love and self-aggrandizement, and placing the common good over that of the individual. One of Cushman's arguments focused on the destructive consequences of self-love. He was concerned with self-serving and dishonest practices that had been on the rise in England. The king granted monopolies on various types of trade to his favorites. There were abuses associated with money lending. Think of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. Landowners deprived tenants of the use of common lands, enclosing those areas to amass personal wealth by raising sheep. Prices were inflated and goods frequently adulterated. Cushman claimed that too many of his generation think, as he put it, to have more in this world, being born as they think to take their pleasures and their ease. Let the roof of the house drop through, they stir not, he preached. Let the field be overgrown with weeds, they care not. They must not soil their hand, nor wet their foot. It is enough for them to say, go you, not let us go, though never so much need. Such idle drones, he said, are intolerable in a settled commonwealth, much more in a commonwealth which is but as it were in the bud. He told the Plymouth colonist that when some withdraw themselves and retire to their own particular ease, pleasure, or profit, what heart can other men have to go in about their business? When men are come together to lift some mighty piece of timber or vessel, if one stands still and does not lift, shall not the rest be weakened and disheartened? Will not a few idle drones spoil the whole stock of laborious bees? He warned that, quote, one idle belly, one murmurer, one complainer, one self-love will weaken and dishearten a whole colony. Great matters have been brought to pass where men have cheerfully, as with one heart, hand and shoulder, gone about it, both in wars, buildings, and plantations. But where every man seeks himself, all cometh to nothing. Indeed, in such cases, self-love ended up being against the individual's own self-interest. Even as we deal with others, Cushman cautioned, ourselves and others shall be dealt with. Carest thou not how others fare, how they toil, are grieved, pinched, cold, harborless, so as thou be in health, liveth at ease, warm in thy nest, farest well. The days will come when thou shalt labor, and none shall pity thee. Be poor, and none relieve thee. Be sick, and lie and die, and none visit thee. Yea, and thy children shall lie and starve in the streets, and none shall relieve them. As an example of what this meant in a colonial situation, Cushman pointed to the disorder that persisted in Jamestown, telling his audience that it is reported that there are many people, that many men gone to that other plantation in Virginia, which, whilst they lived in England, seemed very religious, zealous, and conscionable, and have now lost even the sap of grace to all goodness and are becoming mere worldlings. This testimony I believe to be partly true, he said, and among the very many causes of this, self-love is not the least. As for Plymouth, the country is yet raw, he pointed out, the land untilled, the cities not builded, the cattle not settled. Besides, how many of our dear friends did die at our first entrance? Many of them, no doubt, for want of good lodging, shelter, and comfortable things. And many more may go after them quickly if care be not taken. Is this then a time for men to seek themselves? Yet, Cushman claimed that he pressed his arguments because I see many, both wise and religious, which yet are so tainted with this persistent self-love as it is in them, even as a dead fly to the apothecary's ointment, spoiling the efficacy of all graces, making their lives uncomfortable to themselves and unprofitable to others, being neither fit for church nor commonwealth, but of even their very souls in hazard thereby. Observing the selfishness of some of the colonists, Cushman asked, "Of what earth, I pray thee, art thou made? Of any better than other sons of Adam? And canst thou see other of thy brethren toil their hearts out, and thou sit idly at home, or take thy pleasure abroad? Resemble the example of Uriah, who would not take his ease, nor his pleasure, though the king required him. And why? Because his brethren, his associates, better men than himself as he esteemed them, were under hard labors and conditions." As Dr. Hambrick Stowe pointed out in his talk, Cushman argued that such an attitude was not only destructive of the social order, but also a sin. Impulses to seek ourselves and have not a charitable, loving, and reverent regard of others, Cushman stated, are unexpedient, unprofitable, and unlawful, and therefore must be forborne. And he that hath not learned to deny himself even the very use of useful things, when attended to the contempt, reproach, great offense, and shame of his other brethren and associates, hath learned nothing right, but is apparently a man that seeks himself, whom St. Paul condemns. Associating self-seeking with sin was a familiar refrain in this time. The clergyman Richard Greenham interpreted the 8th commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," to require tradesmen and artisans to avoid extorting, deceiving, or oppressing their customers. The clergyman William Perkins argued that self-interest undermined social peace, and other biblical commentators offered similar messages. Erasmus argued that if you see your brother treated unjustly, but your feelings are not disturbed, because your own fortunes are not endangered, then your soul is dead. And so Cushman offered a remedy. He told the assembled colonists that the bane of all these mischiefs which arise among you is that many are too cleaving to themselves in their own matters and disregard and condemn all others. And therefore, I charge you, he said, let this self-seeking be left off and turn the stream another way. Namely, seek the good of your brethren, please them, honor them, reverence them, for otherwise it will never go well among you. For both of these Puritan layman preachers, Winthrop as well as Cushman, extending love to one's neighbor was an essential part of living a godly life. And as Cushman, in words that would be echoed by Winthrop, exhorted the Plymouth colonist to labor, to be joined together as one body, and knit by flesh and sinews, away with envy of the good of others, and rejoice in his good and sorrow for his evil. Let his joy be your joy, and his sorrow thy sorrow. Let his sickness be thy sickness, his hunger thy hunger, his poverty thy poverty. And if you profess friendship, be friends in adversity, for then a friend is known and tried, and not before. This command was of special importance for the men and women of Plymouth, because, as he pointed out, you have given your names and promises one to another, and covenanted here to cleave together in the service of God and the King. And as he proceeded to hammer home on the message, you must seek still the wealth of one another, and inquire as David, how liveth such a man? How is he clad? How is he fed? He is my brother, my associate. We ventured our lives together here and had a hard brunt of it, and we are in league together. Is his labor harder than mine? Surely I will ease him. Hath he no bed to lie on? I have two. I'll lend him one. Hath he no apparel? Why, I have two suits. I'll give him one of them. Eats he coarse fare, bread and water, and I have better? Why, surely we will part steaks. He is as good a man as I, and we are bound to one another, so that his wants must be my wants, his sorrows, my sorrows, his sickness, my sickness, and his welfare, my welfare. For I am as he is, and such a sweet sympathy were excellent, comfortable, yea, heavenly, and is the only maker and conference of churches and commonwealths. And where this is wanting, room comes on quickly. I refer to this message as a Puritan social gospel, but it needs to be stressed that it is more broadly part of a Christian social gospel rooted in the Bible. At its heart is Jesus' command to his disciples, recorded in Luke chapter 22, verse 39, love thy neighbor as thyself. But it is found throughout the scriptures, and Cushman and other Puritans drew on many texts to drive it home. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 urges believers, one suffer with another, love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous. John Calvin's commentary on that verse enjoined all to love as brethren, urging that everyone not only cares for himself, but also regards the benefit of others. The Geneva Bible gloss on Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3, counseled that each person should be so much touched as if their misery were yours. The Psalter, used by many Congregationalists, was Thomas Sternhold's whole book of Psalms. The translation of Psalm 41 read, that the Lord will help that man again that helpeth poor and weak. It has been pointed out that Sternhold's paraphrasing of the Hebrew of Psalm 49 included a strikingly forceful lament about the rich man who oppresses the poor, and because of vainly trusting in their goods, will perish evermore. And these are but a few passages pointing to the same command. Words are one thing, actions are another. Were there consequences for this Puritan social gospel? A book could be written focusing only on how these ideals shaped Puritan lives in both England and America. A quick look at some of the ways the ideas were put into practice is instructive for our present purposes. In England, various individuals felt compelled by their faith to come to the aid of less fortunate members of their community. This was particularly true of those who organized themselves into covenanted groups, such as urged upon believers by Richard Rogers and others. Many of these groups would evolve into religious congregations. John Winthrop, who was himself a member of one such group of covenanted laymen and clergy in the Groton neighborhood, donated land in his Groton Manor estate for the construction of housing for the community's poor who had been displaced by the new economic forces. Gathered congregations, such as that at Scrooby, were committed not only to assist one another spiritually, but as Cushman himself pointed out in his treatise, A Cry of the Stone, the church and people of God go hand in hand, both in sickness and health, in poverty and in wealth, in adversity and prosperity, rejoicing together, weeping together, and being of like affection in a sweet and heavenly sympathy, holding out in adversity without shrinking, and persevering in prosperity with all moderation. In the town of Boxford, neighboring on Winthrop Scroton, the chief inhabitants of the parish signed an agreement in 1608 for the better ordering of the society. Following a disastrous fire in 1613 in Dorchester, England, the Puritan clergyman John White, who would be heavily involved in New England colonizing ventures, launched a campaign to expand poor relief, support a hospital and school, and improve care for the sick and elderly. Such Christian charity would be pervasive in New England. During the first winter, the Mayflower passengers spent in Plymouth, the first winter that the Mayflower passengers spent in Plymouth, many sickened, and in the end, almost half had died. At the height of the crisis, William Brewster and Miles Standish, two of the very few who were not gravely ill, fetched wood to keep the fires going in the building where the sick lay. They made the beds, dressed the sick, and performed, as William Bradford recorded, all the homely and necessary offices for them, which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to be named. In the following years, the efforts of Brewster, Bradford, Winslow, and other leaders were compared to the example of Nehemiah, who, according to Cushman in his 1621 sermon, when the people were hard put to it and the land raw, he took note of the duties which were due to him for being a magistrate. He bought no land, nor grew not rich, for it was not time. But he maintained at his table many of his brethren the Jews, and so spent even his own proper goods. Looking back at the early days of Massachusetts, Cotton Mather would identify John Winthrop as the American Nehemiah because of his activities in the first struggling years of Massachusetts, working in the fields with other colonists and sharing his supplies with those who lacked food. The actual covenants of most of the early churches of New England survive, and they all, in one way or another, pledge those who accept them to mutual love and support, spiritual, but also explicitly material in some cases. Thus, the covenant of the Concord, Massachusetts church, formed in 1636, looking back at what they called the yoke and burdening traditions they had left behind in England, promised to carefully avoid all oppression and hard dealing, and to walk in peace, love, mercy, and equity towards each other, doing to others as they would do unto us. Charity was put into practice by individuals, churches, and communities. In addition to calling John Winthrop the American Nehemiah, Cotton Mather extolled the Massachusetts governor for having been like Joseph, unto whom the whole body of the people repaired when their corn failed them, Winthrop supplying them from his own stores. Each New England congregation appointed 2 or 3 individuals to the office of deacon. These men collected weekly donations for the minister's salaries, but also for the church stock from which they dispensed funds to those in need. The same John White, who organized help for the needy of Dorchester, England, urged John Winthrop to provide for a public storehouse for the relief of the poor, sick, and infirm in Massachusetts. Colony records are filled with specific appropriations for the needy. In 1641, the Massachusetts General Court granted 30 bushels of corn to a person in distress. 6 years later, it remitted taxes for those who were poor as a result of sickness or other infirmities. While this social outlook wasn't unique to Puritans, it did become deeply rooted in New England, thanks in part to the urgings of Cushman, Winthrop, and their fellow Congregationalists. And so it is not surprising that over the following centuries, New Englanders would take the lead in advancing causes such as abolition, the humane treatment of the insane, and universal education. The Congregationalist clergyman Washington Gladden would be one of the key figures in the social gospel movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in my own lifetime, I have heard the message reiterated once more with reference drawn to John Winthrop's Christian Charity sermon. While it has become commonplace for politicians to quote the City on a Hill reference in Winthrop's Christian Charity sermon and to misconstrue it as a message of American exceptionalism, some, particularly in New England, have focused on the more central message, Winthrop's urging about the importance of community. In 1988, accepting the Democratic Party nomination for the presidency of the United States, then Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis urged the nation to embrace, quote, the idea of community, the idea that we are in this together, that regardless of who we are or where we come from or how much money we have, each of us counts. And that by working together to create opportunity and a good life for all of us are enriched, not just in economic terms, but as citizens and as human beings. The idea of community, Dukakis said, was an idea that was planted in the New World by the first governor of Massachusetts. And more recently, following the Boston Marathon bombing, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren declared that, quote, in times of calamity, In times like these, we remember the words of John Winthrop, who counseled the founders of Boston to do justly, to walk, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must delight in each other, make others' condition our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Words that were meaningful in the 17th century when uttered by Winthrop and Cushman, words that are equally meaningful today. Thank you.